Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Renee Reiner, and with my partner, Mike DeSanto, we own Phoenix Books. We are located here in Burlington on Bank Street, and we also have a location in Essex. And we are delighted that you joined us tonight for a very exciting panel conversation about marriage equality. Important topic. I'm very excited. Susan will be introducing all of our various panelists. And so we thank you. We have books for sale afterwards. And in addition, our editors are donating a portion of the proceeds of the sale of the book to benefit marriage equality. And Mike and I, in conversing about this, decided that we would do the same. And so for books that are purchased tonight, we will also donate 10% to Freedom to Marry. And so we wanted you all to know that. So if you have gifts to buy especially, do it tonight, and that would be great. And if there are questions, they'll be taking questions, and Susan will repeat the questions to make sure that you all hear them. And thank you very, very much.
My name is Susan Murray, and I'm an attorney here in Burlington at Lang Roxbury & Wool. I didn't actually have a whole lot to say because I'd rather listen to the panelists, but I just wanted to say I actually have read this book. It's a great book. It's a history book, but it's not a boring history book. It's a book, for me, it's a book about courage. The history of the gay and lesbian civil rights movement, and especially the issue of marriage equality, is really, to me, a history about courage, about the courage of gay and lesbian people to come out to their families and their friends and their neighbors and their coworkers. And it's also the history of the courage of straight allies to stand up for their gay and lesbian family members and friends, and to not be afraid to speak truth. So this book starts back in the 70s. Remember Harvey Milk, when it was really hard to be a gay person, and then it moves through the AIDS epidemic. And there's a wonderful intro or interview, I should call it, by Bill Lippert, who is the representative and the only out representative in Montpelier during the civil unions debate in 2000, and this book also reproduces his speech on the floor of the House, which was an incredibly powerful speech and changed a few votes. So, and it moves all the way through to President Obama today, and has a wonderful afterword by Governor Madeleine Kunin. So I'm going to stop there, introduce our panelists, and then let them do the substantive speaking. So to my immediate left, Governor Kunin probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to read this anyway.
Okay. See what happens.
Governor Madeleine Kunin was the first female governor of Vermont, as we know, and she also served as the Deputy Secretary of Education and as ambassador to Switzerland under President Bill Clinton. Two very big deals. She's the author of 3 books. Her first book was called Living a Political Life. Her last book was called The New Feminist Agenda, and my personal favorite in terms of its title is Pearls, Politics, and Power. I love that. She is currently a Marsh Professor at Large scholar at the University of Vermont, and is also a commentator on VPR, as most of you know, and a blogger for the Huffington Post. And just as an aside, what I remember is in the 80s, Governor Kunin appointed a gay man, Keith Goslant, and a lesbian, Holly Perdue, as official liaisons to the governor's office from the gay and lesbian community back at a time before there was a hate crimes bill, before there was an anti-discrimination bill, before there was protection for gay and lesbian families in terms of adoption rights, and way before there was civil unions or even marriage equality. So this was the first time in my recollection that there was some official support and recognition in the executive branch of the government here in the state of Vermont. So for that, I thank you. Next is Ellen, actually on the end there, Ellen Anderson is University of Vermont Associate Professor in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies and Political Science. Ellen specializes in the politics of sexuality. She's particularly interested in how individuals and social movements try to use the law to affect social change, a topic near and dear to my heart. Her book, Out of the Closet and Into the Courts, The Legal Opportunity Structure and Gay Rights Litigation, explores the promise and limits of legal mobilization as a tactic for advancing gay rights claims. Her current research project focuses on the politics of same-sex marriage. She has a 25-year history of activism on issues related to sex and sexuality. And then in the middle is Mary Burke. Mary's primary areas of specialization are in gender, sexualities, and social movements, with an emphasis on LGBTQ social movements and queer politics. She has conducted research on mainstream and alternative press coverage of the same-sex marriage debate, focusing especially on the place of feminist and queer critiques of the institution of marriage within the debate. She has also conducted ethnographic research with an LGBT marriage equality group, examining the relationship between professionalization and emotions in social movements. Mary currently holds the position of lecturer in the sociology department and gender, sexuality, and women's studies program at UVM. So thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Phoenix Books, for hosting us tonight. And what Susan Murray neglected to say in her introduction, that she and Beth Robinson were the two lawyers who really created the whole issue in Vermont in the Baker case. The full name of the Baker case is
Baker versus State of Vermont.
Baker versus State of Vermont. Thank you for the good reminder. So thank you for that, Susan. And yes, we wouldn't have had civil unions, and if we hadn't had civil unions, we wouldn't have marriage equality. So, Susan just asked me, how did I get into this? How did I become a co-editor of this book? Well, I'm a friend of Jennifer Baumgardner's. I had interviewed her for my earlier book, Pearls, Politics, and Power, and she's written about the third wave of feminism. So she asked me if I would co-edit this book and if I had some ideas. So she recruited most of the writings in here, and I added a few, and then I wrote an afterword. And I thought it might be easiest if I just read some excerpts of that afterward. Now, I begin the afterward with some thoughts about, how governors decide where to show up, which is always a decision. When I received the invitation one day in June of 1986 to speak at the Great Gay Pride Parade down Church Street in Burlington, Vermont, I paused. So did my staff. I don't recall precisely what went through my mind at that moment, but while I could easily have said no, as most politicians did, I knew I had to say yes. By saying yes, I was making a statement of support for the gay and lesbian community. I had taken a small step in that direction soon after I was elected. I had appointed an official liaison with the gay community. That was a first, both for them and for me, but it was between us. Having a liaison meeting with me at the office was not like showing up in public and hearing the cameras click. When my trooper stopped the car close to the steps that led to the doors of the white-steepled Unitarian Church at the head of Church Street, I was nervous. One glance at the boisterous crowd, and I knew this would not be like any majorette-led parade that I had ever attended. During the 80s, the gay and lesbian community enjoyed being outrageous. The scourge of AIDS hadn't yet descended. This event was a wild and colorful celebration. The statement the gay marchers made was not yet a clear demand for equal rights. It was a demand for recognition. We are here. See us, hear us, and listen to us. Showing up at the parade was more of a test of courage for the marchers than for me. It marked the first coming out for many men and women. That excitement of liberation from the confines of the closet, combined with the thrill of recognition, you too, exploded into joy. I was pulled into the drum-beating, feet-stomping crowd and no longer wanted to hold myself apart. The exuberance of the moment embraced me. As governor, I knew about contrasts, going from one event to another, tasting different slices of life, from birthday celebrations to funerals. But no contrast was more clear than going from the Gay Pride Parade in Burlington in the morning to the Veterans of Foreign Wars celebration 22 miles north in St. Albans that afternoon. Up the road a piece, as a Vermonter might say. I found myself marching in step with the standard-bearing, uniformed, medal-bedecked veterans, flags held high, as we paraded on the quiet, tree-lined town green. The only sounds heard were the ritual shouts of commands promptly obeyed as they had long practiced. What if they knew where I just was, I thought to myself. The rainbow-colored scene I had just left still bouncing in my mind's eye. What would they think? Could I even have felt disloyal to the veterans for having been there? Impossible to believe that now. But in the late 1980s, these were two different worlds. I'm skipping a bit. We were not there yet in 1986 when I attended my first Pride event. A few days after my speech at the Unitarian Church, I received a hint that my appearance at the Gay Pride Parade did not receive uniform approval. I was told that my picture, as it appeared in the local Burlington Free Press, had been taped to a cash register in a general store in the Northeast Kingdom, a sparsely populated region of the state. The photographer had taken pains to make sure that the banner that read Gay Pride Day was clearly legible. I was shown standing at the podium underneath the banner. Someone had taken the trouble to draw a thick red circle around the photo with a diagonal red slash across it. No. Try not to be too long. Much of Vermont was far from ready to abandon bias and accept equality. The most ugly display of anti-gay bigotry occurred in Burlington when a young man who had just left a gay bar was found bloodied and beaten unconscious in an adjoining alleyway. For a week, it was not known whether he would live or die. The attack occurred while a legislative committee was debating whether to include gay and lesbian assaults in a hate crimes bill. It would create tougher penalties for crimes committed on the basis of racial or religious bigotry. I decided to testify before the committee. Until that day, I had carefully observed the separation of powers that every school child learns: executive, legislative, and judicial. As the executive, I had never appeared before a legislative committee, not my territory. What made me step in this time? Something flashed in my mind. It was like a danger signal. I could not ignore it. I was compelled to show up. I had to make a statement that violence based on homosexuality must be strongly condemned and punished. The committee members listened to my testimony. Weeks later, a part of a large chorus of like-minded voices, our outrage was transformed into law. As I look back, I believe I acted on instinct. My mind suddenly reeled back to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, where gay men were among the first to be transported to the death camps. Instead of being forced to wear the yellow Jewish star, gay people were identified by pink triangles. My reaction was best expressed by the words of the Protestant pastor Martin Niemöller, who himself spent 7 years in concentration camps for opposing Hitler. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I'll just give you one more outlook on my evolution. As I look back, I understand that to show up at these events not because I was courageous, but because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I did not speak out, the disease of bigotry would go viral, spreading uncontrolled as it did during the years of the Holocaust. Unlike my relatives who were killed simply because they were Jews, I was a different person living in a different time and place. I was an American Jew with the power of the governor's bully pulpit to support me. It was safe for me to use my voice, to have my picture in the paper under the parade banner. On some not yet fully understood level, I felt that speaking out against hatred when I had the opportunity to do so was my memorial to them, those who died. There is another, more easily explained reason that I chose to show up to endorse the gay and lesbian rights movement. My daughter. When Julia first told me that she loved a woman, I was taken aback. It was the late 1970s. I was in denial. Like many parents at that time, I thought it was a stage she would go through and then grow out of, find a boyfriend, get married, and have kids. That's how I imagined the adult life of my daughter. Now the pieces of the picture were scattered and no longer fit together. She had become a different person than the one I had imagined. Plus, I feared for her. I was afraid she would be vulnerable to attack, both physically and emotionally. Life is hard enough as a woman, I thought. Why did she place this added burden on herself? Looking back, I recognize that at the time, I still thought she had a choice. It took me longer to recognize that as a lesbian, this is part of who she is. It just happened. I never censored or buried it, she told me recently. Instead of harboring any thoughts of trying to change her over the years, she has changed me. She enabled me not only to accept her sexuality, but to go beyond acceptance, to embracing who she is with pride. Still, on some level, the mama bear part of me wanted to do what I could to protect her. That's why I had to show up, to speak up, to make her lesbianism not a dangerous aberration, but a safe and ordinary existence.
So I just wanted to talk about, I guess I'll make sort of a couple comments that I thought about as I was reading the book. And they're really sort of related to sort of thinking about aspects of the title. And so one topic that really interested me and that I would actually really love to sort of hear other people's thoughts on is that the sort of subtitle of the book is American Leaders Who Believe in Marriage Equality. And one of the things that I was really struck by when I was reading through these various speeches is that there's definitely sort of a distinction where we see cases of kind of early adopters, right? Sort of people who are talking about these issues and really sort of coming out in a very supportive way early on. And there's a real sort of distinction between sort of those folks and then folks who are only sort of really recently sort of and oftentimes switching, right? So that they've sort of been longtime opponents of these issues or sort of spoken against issues like same-sex marriage and then have recently shifted their perspectives. And so this is something I'm interested in terms of thinking about this issue of leadership, right? And sort of like what are we talking about in terms of who are really sort of the leaders and the leading voices and what's happening between sort of this difference between folks who really came out in places where, as you noted in parts of the book, where there were repercussions, right? So some folks lost their seats because they supported these issues, right, in sort of in state politics aspects versus sort of the difference of people who kind of jump on the bandwagon, right? So sort of come after these waves of sort of support have grown. And one of the other issues that certainly, and this is significant for me, especially in the context of sort of the areas that I do research, is that while this book is about sort of people saying we do, I actually focus a lot more within sort of the LGBT community about people who say we don't, right? So especially in terms of issues around critiques of marriage within the LGBT community and sort of intra-community debates around these issues. So I just wanted to make sort of, so I certainly think that's sort of an important piece to this discussion, and I appreciate that there's sort of recognition to that, especially in the foreword. And a couple of things that I would say that I was thinking about in terms of this issue is one that, as Jennifer and Madeleine are pointing out, that it feels in a sense that there's been, and you can certainly see this reflected in public opinion polls, for instance, that it feels like there's been a sea change in terms of attitudes around same-sex marriage in the United States. And I would actually like to add that I think sort of an interesting sea change that I experience is a shift in sort of media attention to, as well as my students and my classes' familiarity with these queer critiques of marriage. So I'm actually sort of alongside of these sort of shifts where more people are sort of talking and more people seem to be accepting ideas around same-sex marriage. That's also, and this is something I'm hopeful about, is also creating this space to have these sort of more nuanced conversations about marriage, about citizenship, about sort of the role of the state in recognizing various types of families, right? So not just same-sex couples, but sort of who else can we talk about in terms of families? And something that Ellen and I were talking about is certainly that, one of the things we always want to be conscientious of is the sort of dangers of talking about same-sex marriage as sort of this last place that we need to go, right? So this sort of last vestige of inequality, whether it's sort of inequality broadly or inequality for LGBT people. And I think we need to sort of be conscientious about, what marriage can do and what marriage can't do, and also sort of what the law can't do and what sort of the law can't do in terms of a lot of issues that impact various folks in the community. And one of the things that Ellen and I said I would make sure to note this is to sort of think about this. This is actually sort of officially in the United States context, the Transgender Day of Remembrance today, although in Burlington, there was a event that took place the other weekend. And so I think this is something that we can think about, right? That while it's important for us to talk about marriage, there are sort of huge issues in terms of violence, and this is especially true for trans and gender nonconforming people, and also this is particularly true for trans and gender nonconforming queer people of color in our community, right? So we see very different rates of, for instance, violence. And so we want to think about both sort of what marriage can do, but also what are the issues that we're not sort of addressing if we're only talking about marriage. So those are sort of a few things that I certainly thought about in the context of reading this book, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much to Susan Mary to agree to moderate this. I have a story to tell that involves Susan Mary's law partner, Beth Robinson, who was nice enough.
Former law partner, now Justice.
Sorry, former law partner, then at the time. Quite right. So Justice Robinson married my wife and I last month, and it was the third wedding that we'd had. Right? We got married the first time in 1995, and it was a religious ceremony of commitment when we were living in Michigan, and of course it had no legal standing at all. And that's what we like to call our marriage for love. And then I got, Susan Marie and I came up to Vermont, as we had a habit of doing over every New Year, because we had a bunch of friends here, and we came up and we celebrated, and it was all very lovely. And when civil unions were instituted, we decided that we would be one of the 5,000 couples that came in that year from out of state to have a civil union to speak out politically in favor of this new institution, even though, as Beth and Susan felt, Susan Mary at this point, not Susan, my wife, civil unions was at the most half a loaf, right? It was an amazing advance, and at the same time, it was a complete slap in the face. And yet we thought half a loaf better than none. We're pragmatic that way, and we wanted to do this. So this was our marriage for politics. Right. So we came up, we had a civil union, Justice of the Peace, who we'd never met before, a lovely guy, talked like this the whole time. And we had a lovely wedding. We spent a lot of money for the weekend in Vermont, and we went home, right? Where our civil union license remained very proudly in a file cabinet in our drawer, being of no use to us at all, except to say that we had it, and then 2 years later, I got a phone call out of the blue from Beth Robinson. Now I study LGBT litigation, and at the time I was writing a book on LGBT litigation, and I get a call from Beth Robinson. This is funny, I'm writing a chapter about her right now. But she pulled my name from the list of people who had civil unions. She is a Hoosier, so she was coming back home to Indiana for her high school reunion and thought there's a very good reason why not raise some money when I'm there? And so Beth Robinson corralled me in that way that she has into putting on a fundraiser for Vermont Freedom to Marry, which I did, and raised some certain amount of money and got to know her and spent some time talking with her. And we never lost touch after that. And then I found myself here in Vermont. We moved here on purpose so that we could raise our daughter in a place that respected our family, and had a civil union that all of a sudden meant something in the law. So that was very nice all of a sudden. And then when Vermont turned to marriage in 2009, we didn't get married because from our purposes, it was nothing but a statement about that we would call it a marriage instead of a civil union. And that's been absolutely irrelevant to my life. Right? On a personal level, I don't care what the state calls it. Right? I care that my relationship is protected. And then come June, when the Supreme Court strikes down the federal aspect of DOMA, all of a sudden I care about marriage, right? Because shortly thereafter, the federal government ruled that civil unions didn't count. And so I happened to be vacationing in Norway, which is where all of my family is. And I turned to Susan, my twice wife, and I said, honey, we have to get married again. And so we decided if we were going to do it, it was going to be a party, right? So we had a party. And so that was our third marriage, and that is the marriage that we had for money, right? That's the marriage for security. It's the marriage for Social Security. It's the marriage for insurance. So we've hit the trifecta, right? We've married for love, for politics, and for money now. I think we're done. At least I made her promise that we were done, right? I have 3 wedding rings from 3 different weddings, and this is it, okay? We had these handmade here in Vermont. We love them, and I'm done. Because marriage means those 3 different things, right? Marriage is about commitment and love and sort of making a stand in front of the community that this is the person with which you intend to spend your life, ideally. But marriage is also intensely political, right? Marriage marks insiders and outsiders, right? Marriage has been one of the places where the stand has been made most fiercely because it does mark the cultural inclusion of people, right? It was a big deal when Ronald Reagan was running for president because he had been divorced. I know that for some of you this is ancient history, I understand. But it was a big deal about whether or not a divorced man was ever suited to be president. Right? We give marriage now is one of the major marks of adulthood in our society. It's not really graduating from high school anymore. Getting a driver's license is great when you're 16 or 17, but once that's happened, it's kind of gone as a marker of adulthood, right? What we have is being married, right? Is a major social status symbol. And there's no way you can divorce all this from politics. It's also about money. It's also about pragmatic rights and benefits. It's about the fact that no longer does my relationship with my wife of 20 years wink in and out of legal existence every time we cross a state boundary, not for purposes of federal law, not for purposes of her, God forbid, getting into an accident and me needing to go into the hospital and seeing her, right? It winks back out of existence were we to move to Ohio for lots of purposes of state law, right? Because we live in a federal system. And it's lovely that I have this little free space that I can exist in. I mean, I carry, and I have, since 1995, legal documents and legal papers. And Susan, I need to update those, speaking of which, okay?
I brought my card.
Thank you very much. right? There are healthcare benefits and all of the proxies and all of that sort of stuff. And I carry one. We have them in each of our suitcases. And I carry them in the bag I carry around with me. And it's old habit to try and protect my relationship being on the outside of the law. And all of a sudden, there's like this space where I can go between Maine and Maryland, right? And I can get all the way down and not have to worry about it. I mean, at least not in theory.
Yep.
I have to worry about it. And it's delightful, right? Eventually, I'll just be able to connect through Chicago to make my way out to California, and life will be grand. So I want us to think about, when we're talking about marriage, we're talking about multiple things, right? We can't treat it as a unidimensional feature because it's not in our own lives, right? And it's not for those of us who choose not to marry either. Marriage is multifaceted. And I left out the religion part because I think of that as being combined with a social context of where you stand. But certainly we can talk about how every major religion of which I am aware, every major religion and every religion of which I am aware has some sort of marriage ceremony, some sort of union ceremony. And it's a core feature of saying you exist within this community of religious people and are blessed within this community of religious people. I mean, it's a complicated institution we're talking about. So those are my comments.
Excellent.
Can I just respond quickly? Thank you. That was great from both of you. There was an article in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago saying, hey, not every gay and lesbian person wants to get married. Like this was a big announcement. You have the choice now, which is what is important. But it was like, a revelation. It was treated that way. I mean, not every straight couple wants to get married. Why should every gay couple want to get married? So, but the way you layered it is very interesting and very edifying. And I just want to comment how quickly this movement emerged and became part of our structure. When I described that gay pride, that's ancient history, but it wasn't that long ago. So I've never seen a social movement move this fast. And, people always say, well, how do you change the culture? Is it by passing laws, or do you have to wait for public opinion for the culture to change? Well, in this case, they both happened. And they didn't happen by accident. You should talk about this more, but civil unions, a lot of legwork went on before that. I mean, Susan and Beth, went to the Rotaries and went to all sections of Vermont to lay the seeds of public opinion. But I think the reason it really happened so fast, some of the reasons, we don't know all of them. One is that the gay community itself came out. And suddenly, these were our children, our co-workers, our neighbors, and we saw it at the hearings in Montpelier on civil unions. I mean, whole families participated. So it wasn't them, the other, it was us, and it had a face. They also worked very hard politically. They raised money. And one of the benefits of the gay community is they happen to be more affluent. And it was, in many cases, bipartisan. So they used the political system as well as seeing the culture change. And I had an interesting conversation just yesterday. I spoke to 3 different classes at UVM on women and gender studies. And, I sort of asked, I just use that example as a hopeful example of how we might have other changes in society, like on family and work. And I said, how does your generation feel about same-sex marriage or marriage equality? And the best answer I got, it's just not cool to be homophobic. and who would have thought?
Yeah. I have a lot of stuff that I wrote down here, but I wanted to open it up to if anybody has any questions at this point in time. Otherwise, I'll fill the gaps with some thoughts or questions myself. Anybody?
You're about to.
You're thinking about it though. No. Well, I'm trying to figure out what the answer to the question is that you asked. How did this happen? I think that a point that you were making, Ellen, was that that the law is, what did you say? That the marriage marks a cultural inclusion for gay and lesbian people, and it's true that. And I think a point you were making, Mary, is that don't just talk about marriage, but talk about broader issues of gay and lesbian, civil rights, transgender, civil rights, etc. And one of the things, as a lawyer, that I think about is the tool of litigation to move that forward. There are academics, there are politicians, and then there are litigators. The law cannot, in and of itself, change people's perceptions and change people's minds, but in my opinion, the law, all of our laws contain important messages to people. They contain messages about who's important and who's not, who's powerful and who's not, who's included and who's not, who's accepted and who's not. I can think of a story that Beth and I used to tell a lot about a lesbian couple who had been together since they met as nurses in the Vietnam War, long time ago in the 60s. And one of them was diagnosed by her doctor. She went in, she was having some tests, she was having some health issues, and her doctor said, "You have cancer. Now we have to," in his office with her, he said, "You have cancer, now we have to start talking about what your treatment's going to be, what your treatment options are, and what your prognosis is." And she put up a timeout and said, "Well, we have to bring Bobby, Roberta, her partner, in to be here to hear this conversation." And the doctor said, "No, she doesn't need to be here. You're my partner. You're my patient." And the woman said, "No, she has my power of attorney. She has my health care power of attorney. She needs to be here." And the doctor said, "But that health care power of attorney doesn't matter unless you are, you, Sandy, is her name, you, Sandy, are unable, you don't have the faculties to take care of yourself anymore." And so she was having this battle with the doctor, and, needless to say, she fired her doctor and went elsewhere. But the point was that this doctor, and this is before civil unions, way before, this doctor was taking his cues from the law that said that these two women who'd been together for decades were legal strangers to one another, and he didn't need to even pay attention to that relationship at all. So in my opinion, the law has it plays a huge role in how cultural shifts happen and societal shifts happen. And then one other point I'll make about that is we talk about in the context of how marriage equality happened in Vermont. It happened, as I said at the beginning, because people had the courage to come out. Well, just keep in mind that people came out because the legislature passed, among other laws, a non-discrimination law that said if you're gay, you can't be fired from your job. If you're gay, you can't be kicked out of your housing. If you're gay, you can't be kicked out of a restaurant that you're in. So all of those things that law made it important. It sent a message to the rest of the community in Vermont that these are not people that you can treat differently and treat poorly and treat as second-class citizens. And it also gave a level of protection, legal protection, to people who did have who did want to come out publicly or to their family or friends or coworkers. Suddenly they could do that and not worry about being fired and not worried about losing their job and losing their paycheck. So those are I think the law plays a huge role in how this all happens. Sometimes the law gets ahead of people, but if you also do the kind of grassroots organizing work and the political work to go along with it, and it's a lot of work to do that, and many of you out there have done that work over the years with Beth and I. You have to do both, but I don't want to minimize what the law does and says and how important it is.
Any comments or stories, short stories? Yes. Mary?
Thanks. Something I think is really interesting is the difference.
Does she need a mic? You can hear her? Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Something I think is very interesting is the difference between generations of gay, lesbian, etc. people in looking at this issue. That I think the people I know who are likeliest to be marriage skeptics tend to be my age, more or less, coming out of a feminist framework where, marriage was the bad pie that we didn't want a piece of, essentially. Whereas it's extremely important to a lot of our younger friends who haven't gone through some of the same experiences that we have. But it's very interesting to me. I thought your sequence of the marriage for the three different purposes was a really helpful distinction, and that I just think it's worth pondering where some of those differences lie. In some cases, it's actually a critique. But I know we got, after we were married this summer, we got an email from a friend of ours in the Netherlands saying, now your assimilation is complete. So anyway, those are meandering remarks rather than a question, but you might want to respond.
Does everybody hear the question? Do I need to repeat the question, or is it... You're all set? Okay. So that's an interesting point, because I would want to, again, to follow up with you, Mary, and ask whether you've seen any difference. I think you're right, with the generations, older folks have been much more, especially feminists, have been much more skeptical about marriage as a patriarchal institution, as an assimilationist institution, and have been much less likely to get married. Except in my life, after the Windsor case was decided, the end of June, the DOMA case, I can't tell you how many, this is also interesting about gay and lesbian couples as opposed to straight people, they come in to see their lawyer about whether they should get married. That doesn't typically happen with straight couples, at least in my experience. Because, I think it's because for the longest time, gay and lesbian couples couldn't get married, so it wasn't even on the table. And now when it's on the table, they want to say, well, how is that going to affect my life? Why is it important? Tell me the legal ramifications, the pros and the cons, and in ways that I think the straight community just has never thought about, because it has been that sort of entree into adulthood. You just do it automatically. So what I've experienced, Mary, is since the Windsor case came down, the DOMA case, Section 3 of DOMA was declared unconstitutional in the Windsor case in June, I am seeing people who were previously adamantly opposed to getting married are now getting married. Prominent gay and lesbian couples are now tying the knot. So I don't know what that's all about. So I think it's sort of an interesting issue in the context of one, and this sort of speaks to what Ellen was talking about in terms of, I think it's good. I think it'll pick up. What Ellen was talking about in terms of these different sort of functions of marriage. And so I think one thing that I certainly notice is this idea that we could be, like anyone could be sort of critical of marriage, I think often comes from thinking about marriage really in terms of the love piece, right? And so I think a lot of folks, as you're noting, this sort of difference, if you don't have access to marriage, then you're really sort of thinking about all those things that come along with marriage, where I think a lot of people, if they're not thinking about that, think, we just get married and because we're in love. Right. And then, it just happens that it's this sort of smooth thing where if we file that, then it also comes with all these sort of rights, responsibilities, and benefits. So I think a lot of people don't think about that, right? If they've just always had access to marriage. And then I think in terms of the other issue, I really think it speaks to the financial the financial benefits issue that, once that's actually accessible, right, it becomes is this sort of a pragmatic decision to make in terms of getting sort of access. So, yeah, and I think exactly. So it becomes that. And for the people who I know who haven't done that, despite sort of the opening up of it, that's also about they might be in a particular financial situation where they're okay sort of without that, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, so it's even more pragmatic for different sorts of people. So, yeah, I think that certainly is something that I see in terms of the financial access issue.
If I can jump in for a second. A couple of things spring to mind. One of which is that there are clear financial benefits to marrying. at the same time, my wife and I were pretty clear-headed about this, and when we chatted with our accountant, she was like, "You want to know how much more it's going to cost you?" Right? Because we happen to be in that bracket of people who make fairly equivalent salaries.
The marriage penalty.
And we're getting kicked, as I understand it, right? And I'm willing to pay that cost up front for access to Social Security down back, and more importantly, for status as next of kin. Right? The status is next of kin, right? We both have elderly parents. Our parents are sick. Neither of us are interested in having our next of kin status devolve to our siblings. And my 11-year-old's not going to cut it just yet, right? She's next of kin for purposes of financial stuff, right? So that would automatically go to her, but she's in no medical decision-making capacity for us. I want that, and that's worth a lot of money to me. But to think more broadly about marriage, and particularly second-wave feminist arguments in opposition to marriage, many of which I agree with. One of the things that happened between the 1970s and the 1990s, when Susan and I first got married, was that marriage changed. It changed in a deeply significant way, based on what sometimes is called the divorce revolution, right? And there is actually lots of good evidence about people's attitudes about what marriage is changing fundamentally during that period of time, from a sense that marriage is indeed until death do us part, and if we break away from it, somebody must have sinned real bad. Like there is a social disapprobation. There has to be an easier word for that. Disapproval. I'll take that. Okay. A social disapproval for people who marry, and it redounds a lot, particularly onto women. Right? With the divorce revolution in the 70s, sparked partly by California's change to no fault and then a whole bunch of other changes, but it starts a little before then, people's attitudes about marriage are much more conditional. If you are a college professor and you ask your college students, how many of you think you're going to get married at some point in your life? About 3/4 of them raise their hand. And then you say, oh, for you guys, how many are you pretty sure if you get married, you're going to stay married for the rest of your life? Almost all the hands drop down.
Interesting.
Marriage takes work, and it takes continuing commitment. And it is exitable by either partner.
Right.
And that fundamentally changes a lot of this patriarchal notion of ownership in marriage. Now, that doesn't mean that women still aren't more screwed than men in the processes of divorce, right? It doesn't change many of those features. But it does change the sense of somehow selling yourself in sort of a permanent bondage from which you cannot escape without real harm to your social standing.
Well, that dovetails into a question I wanted to ask. Speaking of disapprobation.
Sure. Yes. Disapproval. Yes.
Your disapproval. It's more of a cultural question, less of a legal one. But I'm curious about sort of attitudes in the gay and lesbian community toward divorce. Mm-hmm. Whether there's any kind of additional stigma now, having come through so much tumult to get there. So, what do you all think?
Does everybody hear that question? Yeah. Okay.
Why don't you answer it first?
Well, I'm not the expert in culture, which is what the question was, right?
Divorce.
I can answer the legal question on divorce, but...
The culture question is that, to most of my knowledge, we don't have any information on that yet. I mean, I like to be able to turn around and say, here's what the data say, and I don't have data on that. There certainly was... If the plural of anecdote is anecdata, which it really isn't, but I'm going to go with it for the moment, there is some sense of fear among folks who were leading the charge for marriage, so leadership within the community, about what could be done, like how damaging it could be if people divorced quickly. And you know what? Some of it happened. Right? And some of it was from among the many couples who put their lives on hold and had their lives turned inside out by willing to be plaintiffs for the right to marry. That's got to be, we talk about these traumatic life moments. Getting married is one of them, losing a job, getting a job, moving, right? These are all these major stressful life moments, a child with a significant illness. Being a plaintiff in a test case lawsuit that goes on for 6 years, that gets news coverage all over the place, gotta be up there. All right? And some of these couples didn't make it. And certain opponents of marriage equality grabbed onto that quickly as the sign that gay people weren't serious about marriage. What was fascinating to me was that that argument wasn't able to secure kind of a toehold in the larger public discourse about it. Why? I'm not sure, but I think that by that time everybody realized that marriages break up. And if marriage is conditional and you can go through stuff that makes good people not able to honestly commit to spending the rest of their lives together, that happens. And so the notion of divorce itself wasn't as scary once it started happening.
I think when it did get complicated is when there are different states with different laws. In the famous custody case of, was it Vermont and Virginia?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was.
That, I guess the long-term answer to that is still a federal law. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Susan?
That was a complicated case that I can't comment on for a variety of reasons, but it's unresolved because the child is now somewhere in South America or Central America. So there's actually federal litigation pending against various members of the church group that one of the women who moved down to Virginia is involved in for helping her escape from the United States with the child. So that's pending. But to get back to the divorce thing, I saw a lot of folks from out of state rush to Vermont to get civil unions back in 2000 because it was, the gate had opened and it was the only place. So sort of like what happened to you and your spouse. And I get calls probably twice a week now. It's, how many years later? 13 years later, from people said, I got a civil union. We live in Idaho, and I got a civil union back in 2000, and now we want to split up. So in contrast, I have not seen very many Vermont couples getting divorced. I want to point out that all three of the Baker plaintiffs couples are still together, happily together, which is nice to know. And I don't know whether that's just because they were just well grounded ahead of time, or whether we prepared the heck out of them to be dealing with the publicity and the media. But they all came through that really well. What I'm wondering, I don't know, and I'm also in my own practice. I do a lot of family law and a lot of divorce work, and I'm not actually seeing same-sex couples, Vermont same-sex couples, coming through my office. And I don't know whether that's because the statistics are low. There are not that many people. People haven't been married very long or haven't been in civil unions very long, so they're not ending their relationships legally. But I have another theory, and I'll throw it out to you professors, which is that for the longest time, gay couples and lesbian couples were outside of the law. We're not able to get married or have a civil union. So when they ended their relationships, they did it themselves. They did it in their own communities. They had their friends help them, and they did it outside of the parameters of the law. And so even now, my theory is even now with marriage, they are tending to do that themselves. And they may go to the family court after they've reached an agreement and fill out the little forms themselves and saying, yep, we've divided all of our assets and we've divided all of our incomes and all of our debts and all of our liabilities, and we hereby sign on the dotted line, they're done. And so they're doing it, outside of the purviews of everybody getting lawyers and fighting over it. Just a theory.
Two things in response to that. I don't want to because I could do this all night, right? One is, we do have some data from Massachusetts, where marriage equality has been the law of the land since 2004. right? So now when we study divorce, we often study it over a period of 15-year increments. So all those divorce statistics that you get, like 1 out of every 2 couples, it's all statistical garbage. All right? For a complicated set of reasons that I could discuss, but partly it's because we measure it over 15-year periods, and we measure things like first marriage dissolution versus second marriage dissolution or third marriage. It's much harder to measure this than you would think it might be. But when we're looking now over the period of almost 10 years, we can say that within that 10-year almost space of time, that the rates of same-sex couples divorcing are not significantly different from the rates of heterosexual couples that are divorcing who are married within the same time period. I mean, finally, we have something we can measure.
Yep.
It's actually a little bit lower. And that's not really surprising, given that, according to some data that I've put together, the average length of time couples who married in the first 3 years that they could, same-sex couples, so 2004, 5, and 6, they were together on average 12 years before they married. I mean, these are fairly established couples, so it doesn't surprise me that they're less likely a little bit, but the numbers aren't big enough that I want to feel real comfortable saying I know for sure that we are better married people than the straights. Okay? And I don't think we are.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I'm not seeing them walking into the lawyer's office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a complicated thing too, right? Because particularly pre-DOMA, if all of your income is in your 401k account, right, you can't just decide to go divide that.
That's right.
Right? You need a judge to say, you're going to do this. Right?
Yeah. I would just like to, for a moment, look at another aspect of this question. And, you know, we in Vermont can be very self-satisfied. But I think we do have to look at the rest of the country. Yes. And where attitudes are so radically different. And in many cases, you know, a fascinating case going on right now in Wyoming with the Senate race, where 2 sisters are on opposite sides. You've probably followed this. Cheney's daughter, Catherine, is married, and her sister is running for the United States Senate. I don't think I'm biased when I say as a carpetbagger from Virginia. And she still feels, even at the expense of her relationship with her sister, that she has to be anti same-sex marriage to get elected in Wyoming. So one of the, you know, how do we move this further? Can we ever, you know, get southern states? There's some states now, mostly southern states, who refuse to follow the federal law in the military about federal benefits. And they send people out of state or to some other office and put up loads of roadblocks. So we can't be too glib about how far we've come. We have come far, as I said at the beginning, and it's a major cultural, social revolution. But any thoughts from any of you about how do we go beyond where will it always be a north-south divide or blue-red divide, or will the fact that so many young people think homophobia is not cool, will that be true in Kentucky and South Carolina as well, and will the old folks just die out, or how else can we do it?
I'd make a couple comments to that. One is I always think, well, there's certainly, right, if we sort of look at polling data, you know, you can definitely see sort of generational issues or sort of regional differences. But I always find, I think a lot of my students kind of think that about issues that, like, once, like, me or, like, the generation above me, right, like, once you older people are gone, right, I'm putting myself in that category because I'm their professor. I might be a little closer to their age than some other professors, but and so I think one is that's always, you know, while we have to recognize that there are generational differences, I sort of want, you know, the younger generation to realize that there's a vast array of difference in terms of sort of perspectives. And I think especially, I mean, this has been different from even coming from Connecticut, right, which is another sort of liberal same-sex marriage state. But even sort of coming from Connecticut, the students here are much more they just much more have this impression that no one their age is homophobic in any way. And I think, right, so you have to sort of dispel them of that.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking, I don't really sort of have an answer to this, but I think your point about, how we sort of move this forward in some sort of more conservative context, I think that's part of what I'm interested in, because if you're having situations where sort of politicians are feeling very comfortable to say, okay, I'm just going to come out and not support this because I'll never get elected. I think sort of in that context, what are sort of the positions of political leaders? So I think that's sort of part of my interest in this issue of how, if you're talking in the context of politics, how you get folks to actually sort of be coming out with supportive positions, even if that means they might not get elected. And would that make a difference in terms of these issues if we didn't have sort of that pandering where people felt that they needed to forward really sort of problematic positions in order to get elected? Because I'm not really sure I understand what's the purpose of being in a position of power if you're doing that by really sort of selling out some of your basic ideals. And I think that's something I wonder about. But I also understand pragmatically that how do you ever get in office in those contexts? So it's just sort of something that strikes me as a difficult issue.
Well, as I try to, for a minute, as I try to answer my own question, I think people have to speak up. I mean, those who are supportive have to let politicians know their votes out there on this side of the equation, just as there are on the other side of the equation. And, of course, that's what you did in the first place. And, you have stronger religious bias in those states and stronger cultural. And, of course, it is more Republican in every sense of the word. You have somewhat more racism in some of those states. But you have to believe in change. And I think the most dangerous thing is if those young people think, well, no problem. There is a problem.
Well, I want to go back to some of what Sue was saying was that creating this safe legal space. In a lot of those states, there are no non-discrimination laws, and there's no federal. I mean, I know they're working on it, but there's no federal non-discrimination law. So maybe once that happens in those places, then people more. And I also think a really important thing is being out. I think it's very powerful to let people know that we're in the community. And like you were saying, it seems to be that combination of a safe, of a legal message. Enabling people to come out and letting people see, we're part of the community and we're we, not, so maybe.
I think you're right. Yeah. The good news is that the folks in states like the South, and the reason why we're talking about this, of course, is because DOMA still has a Section 2 that's still in existence. So DOMA had 2 sections. Section 3, the federal benefits piece, was struck down, but Section 2, Section 1 is the title. Okay, Section 2 is the section that says no state shall be required to allow gay people to get married in their state. Okay, and that Section 2 still exists and still is existing in 32 or 34 states. It is, I think, 34 states. So I think you're right. In the states where we do have marriage equality, we have a model now that those states can use, a grassroots organizing model, working with clergy, working with civic leaders, working with supportive politicians. And it takes a lot of work. It absolutely takes some people feeling safe in that they won't be financially damaged by losing their jobs or their houses, their housing if they come out. So there's a long way to go. And again, to rope back to the lawyer in me, I analogize this a little bit to the battle over what we call the anti-miscegenation laws, the laws against allowing a person of color to marry a Caucasian. Okay, in 1948, 90% of the people, 99% of the people in this country thought that it was a bad idea, that they disapproved. The polls show they disapproved of people of different races from marrying. The first case to outlaw those prohibitions, those marriage laws, was in California in 1948, and a lot of states fell after that. Several states fell after that, but the South was a bastion of laws saying black person can't marry a white person. And it took a case called Loving versus Virginia in 1967 at the U.S. Supreme Court to finally say enough already. You can't discriminate like this. And so that was 19 years from the day the first state case law was thrown out to the time the U.S. Supreme Court spoke. So if you figure Massachusetts was the first state to allow same-sex couples to marry, we're looking at 2023 in 19 years. So there will be, I guess my point is there absolutely has to be grassroots activism in all of these states. It would be nice if there were legislation. It would be nice if there were votes of the popular vote to overturn their constitutional amendments, but really there's going to be litigation in the federal system to try to overturn Section 2 of DOMA at some point in the future. So,
for what it's worth, I think that's exactly right. I think that's spot on. We will have some more. I mean, we're having this little tipping point of states right now. It's been kind of fun. Oh, it's Thursday. What state today has voted? That will peter out fairly soon. Yeah, I think I'm sort of running out of states where I can look at and go, oh, this one's next. Idaho, for example, is not on my list of states where I expect to see change. You have to remember that with the exception of New Mexico, which has got its own legal stuff going on right now, every remaining state has a constitutional amendment on the books.
That's right.
That prohibits same-sex marriage. And those folks who put the constitutional amendment on the books, those activists, were doing that with an eye toward the long term, with an eye toward recognition that overturning a statute is way easier than overturning a constitutional amendment because you need supermajorities. And you need relatively impassioned supermajorities. So just a small impassioned group of people and a bunch of people who are like, hey, yeah, that's cool. Like, that does not overturn constitutional amendments. And I think we will see some states that go back in and re-vote. Yep. In much the same way as we saw in Maine. Yep. But I think it's going to be relatively rare, and we will probably end up with a core of states. I won't be surprised if it's the states we call the Solid South, who remain committed to barriers between same-sex couples marrying. And that will take a Supreme Court ruling. And I think the only question is time at this point. I mean, the long term, we win.
The trajectory is going in the right direction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So,
as Martin Luther King said, if I can quote it directly, the arc of the universe is long, but it trends towards justice.
Justice, yep.
Maybe that's a good note to end on.
That's a great note to end on. All right. Thank you all for coming.